The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the endless stretch of desert, turning the sand into waves of shimmering heat. Martha Hayes wiped the sweat from her brow as she guided her old mule cart along the dusty trail, returning from town with meager supplies. Her hands were rough from years of hard work, her dress faded and patched, but her eyes still held determination. Life hadn't been easy since her husband passed 2 years ago, leaving her with 2 children and a small plot of land that barely produced enough to keep them fed. Every trip to town meant careful calculations, stretching every coin until it screamed for mercy. As the cart bounced over a rocky patch, something in the distance caught her eye. At first she thought it was just another desert mirage, a trick of the heat playing with her tired mind. But as she squinted against the glare, she saw it, a dark shape lying motionless among the sagebrush, about 50 yards from the trail. Her heart quickened. Could be an animal, she thought. Could be nothing. But something deep inside told her to look closer. Against her better judgment, she pulled the reins and climbed down from the cart. The sand crunched beneath her worn boots as she approached cautiously. Then she saw him, a man face down in the dirt, his expensive clothing torn and covered in dust and blood. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin burned red from exposure. Martha knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she checked for a pulse. There it was, faint but steady. He was alive barely. She looked around the empty desert, seeing no horse, no supplies, nothing. Someone had left this man here to die. The question was why, and more importantly, what should she do about it? Taking him in meant using precious water and food. It meant risk. But leaving him meant certain death, and that was something Martha's conscience couldn't bear. Martha's small homestead appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her children, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Thomas, ran out to greet her, their faces falling when they saw the unconscious stranger sprawled in the back of the cart. Emma's eyes widened with concern, while Thomas stepped back nervously. Martha climbed down, her body aching from the effort of lifting the man earlier, and placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. She explained quickly that they had a guest who needed help, and both children knew better than to argue when their mother used that tone. Getting the stranger inside was a challenge that tested every ounce of Martha's strength. She managed to drag him onto the small bed in the corner of their single-room cabin, the same bed where her husband had taken his last breath. The man groaned as she carefully removed his torn jacket, revealing a fine silk vest underneath, now ruined by blood and dirt. His boots were expensive leather, custom-made. This was no ordinary drifter. This was a man of means, and that realization sent a chill down Martha's spine. People with money often had enemies with even more money. Through the night, Martha worked tirelessly, cleaning his wounds with their precious water supply, forcing small sips between his cracked lips. Emma helped by keeping cool cloths ready, while Thomas watched from the doorway, uncertain about this stranger invading their home. The man drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words Martha couldn't understand. By dawn, his fever broke and his breathing steadied. As sunlight filtered through the cabin's small window, the stranger's eyes finally opened, confused and disoriented. He looked around the sparse room at Martha's tired face hovering above him and managed to whisper a single word that would change everything. The stranger's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke his name. Samuel Crawford. Martha's breath caught in her throat. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. Crawford owned the largest ranch in Texas, thousands of acres of prime cattle land, and commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But the man lying helpless in her bed looked nothing like the powerful figure from the stories. He looked broken, vulnerable, human. Samuel's eyes filled with confusion as he tried to piece together what happened. How he ended up in the desert, who brought him here. Martha explained finding him, leaving out her own doubts about the wisdom of her choice. Over the next few days, Samuel's strength slowly returned, though he remained weak and frustrated by his condition. He insisted on sleeping on the floor, giving the bed back to the children, a gesture that surprised Martha. Despite his wealth and status, he showed genuine gratitude for the simple meals she prepared, the threadbare blanket she offered. But questions hung heavy in the air. Samuel remembered riding out to inspect a disputed property line with his foreman, Jack Reeves, a man he'd trusted for 15 years. They'd stopped to water the horses, And then nothing, just waking up in this cabin with a pounding headache and a dry throat. The pieces started forming a disturbing picture. Someone had struck him from behind, taken his horse, his weapons, his water, and left him to die. The most logical suspect was Jack, but Samuel struggled to believe it. Martha listened carefully, noting how painful it was for him to accept betrayal from someone so close. She understood that pain, having learned after her husband's death that several people she considered friends had only valued her when she had something to offer. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore, yet here they were, strangers forced to trust each other. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning. Martha's heart sank as she peered through the window, counting 4 riders heading straight for her property. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Jack Reeves, his weathered face set in a grim expression beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Samuel, still weak but mobile, moved quickly away from the window, understanding the danger instantly. Martha made a split-second decision, gesturing for him to hide in the small root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. Emma helped her mother move the worn rug back into place, just as heavy boots stomped onto the porch. Jack Reeves removed his hat as he entered, his eyes scanning the small cabin with barely concealed suspicion. He introduced himself politely enough, explaining that his employer, Samuel Crawford, had gone missing several days ago, and they were checking every homestead in the area. His voice was smooth, concerned, but Martha noticed how his gaze lingered too long on the bed, on the extra tin cup by the wash basin, on the signs that someone had been staying here. She kept her face neutral, her voice steady as she explained she'd been alone with her children, had seen nothing unusual. The lie tasted bitter but necessary. One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous energy, mentioned they'd found Crawford's horse wandering near the Mexican border. Saddlebags empty, no sign of the boss anywhere. Jack's expression remained carefully blank, but Martha caught something in his eyes, satisfaction maybe, or relief. He thanked her for her time, but as he turned to leave, Thomas, who'd been watching from the corner, spoke up innocently, asking why they were looking for a man his mama had found in the desert. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Jack's head snapped around, his hand moving instinctively toward his pistol, and Martha knew their fragile safety had just shattered. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. Jack's eyes narrowed as he studied Martha's face, watching her scramble for an explanation. She forced a laugh, placing her hand on Thomas's shoulder, explaining that her son had an active imagination, always making up stories about treasure hunters and lost travelers. The boy, sensing his mistake, nodded quickly, but the damage was done. Jack wasn't convinced, though he couldn't search the property without cause. He tipped his hat slowly, promising to return, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. The moment the riders disappeared over the ridge, Samuel emerged from the cellar, his face grave with understanding of what Martha had just risked for him. They talked long into the night, Martha finally hearing the full story. Samuel explained that Jack had been pressuring him for months to sell a portion of the ranch to a railroad company, offering substantial money. Samuel had refused, knowing the route would destroy grazing land and displace families who'd worked his ranch for generations. He'd valued loyalty and legacy over profit, a decision that apparently cost him everything. Jack stood to gain a fortune in commission from the deal, enough to disappear and start fresh anywhere. Leaving Samuel to die solved his problem permanently, or so he thought. Martha listened, understanding now why this mattered beyond one man's survival. If Jack succeeded, families would lose their homes and livelihoods. But helping Samuel meant putting her own children in danger. Emma and Thomas were listening from their corner, and Martha saw the fear in their eyes. She'd always taught them to do the right thing, to help others, but this was different. This was dangerous. Samuel, seeing her internal struggle, offered to leave to take his chances heading to the nearest town on foot. But Martha knew he wouldn't make it 5 miles in his condition, and Jack's men were surely watching the roads. There had to be another way, a path that didn't require her to choose between her principles and her children's safety. The question was whether she could find it before Jack returned, and next time, she knew he wouldn't leave without answers. The solution came from an unexpected source. Emma, who'd been quiet throughout the crisis, reminded her mother about old Sheriff Morrison, a retired lawman who lived 2 towns over and owed their family a favor from years back when Martha's late husband had helped him during a difficult time. It was risky, but it might work. Samuel wrote a detailed account of everything, signing it and including information only the real Crawford would know. Martha would make the journey while Emma stayed to care for Samuel and Thomas, a responsibility that frightened the young girl, but one she accepted with surprising maturity. The ride to find Sheriff Morrison took Martha through dangerous territory, but she pushed forward, driven by something stronger than fear. When she finally found the old sheriff, his reaction confirmed Samuel's story. Morrison had suspected something wasn't right when Jack reported Crawford missing, but seemed strangely unconcerned about finding him. With the signed testimony, Morrison had enough to act. He gathered 2 trusted deputies and rode back with Martha, arriving at her homestead just as Jack and his men returned, this time clearly intending to search thoroughly, with force if necessary. The confrontation was tense but brief. Faced with the sheriff, his deputies, and Samuel Crawford very much alive and ready to testify, Jack's carefully constructed story collapsed. The railroad deal, the planned murder, the theft, everything came tumbling out. Jack and his accomplices were arrested, their scheme destroyed. Samuel, still weak but standing tall, thanked Morrison and then turned to Martha, words failing to express what her courage had meant. He offered her money, land, anything she needed, but Martha's response surprised everyone. She asked only for fair prices at the general store, and maybe some help fixing her fence. Nothing more. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected bloomed between the wealthy rancher and the poor widow. Not romance necessarily, but a deep respect and friendship born from shared adversity. Samuel ensured Martha's homestead flourished, connecting her with opportunities to sell her modest crops at fair prices, while Martha reminded him that wealth meant nothing without integrity and compassion. Her children found themselves with a benefactor who valued their education and future. The desert that had nearly claimed Samuel's life had instead given him something more valuable, a reminder of what truly mattered, and a second chance to live accordingly. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places, and sometimes the greatest wealth is found not in what we own, but in who we choose to be when everything is stripped away. The weeks following Jack's arrest brought unexpected changes to Martha's quiet life. Samuel, recovering his strength at his ranch, sent word through Sheriff Morrison that he wanted to offer Martha a position managing the community outreach for his cattle operation. The job involved coordinating with the families who worked his land, ensuring fair treatment and proper resources, something Samuel admitted he'd neglected while trusting Jack to handle. Martha was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with charity disguised as employment, but Samuel's letter made clear this wasn't kindness, it was necessity. He needed someone he could trust, someone who understood struggle and wouldn't be corrupted by power. Emma and Thomas were thrilled at the prospect of their mother having steady work, especially when they learned it came with a small house on Crawford property, much sturdier than their current cabin. But Martha worried about appearances, about what people would say. A poor widow suddenly elevated by the richest man in the county. Samuel addressed her concerns directly during his first visit since recovering, riding out personally, despite his doctor's protests. He sat at her worn table drinking weak coffee and spoke plainly about his intentions. This was business, he explained, and he needed her particular skills, her ability to see people clearly, to distinguish genuine need from opportunism. Martha accepted, but on her terms. She would take the job and the house, but she'd earn every penny through hard work, no special treatment, no assumptions about their friendship affecting professional decisions. Samuel agreed, relief evident in his weathered face. As he prepared to leave, Thomas asked innocently if Mr. Crawford would join them for Sunday supper sometime, and both adults found themselves agreeing before fully considering the implications. It was just a meal, Martha told herself, just neighbors being neighborly. But as Samuel rode away, Emma caught her mother smiling in a way she hadn't seen since before father died, and the young girl wondered if maybe, just maybe, their lives were finally turning towards something brighter. Martha's first week in her new position revealed challenges she hadn't anticipated. Several families on Crawford land viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as Samuel's spy rather than an advocate. Others resented that an outsider, and a woman at that, had been given authority over matters they felt should be handled by the ranch foreman. The new foreman, a gruff but honest man named Pete Dalton, tried to help smooth relations, but the damage from Jack's years of corruption ran deep. Families had learned to keep their heads down, accept poor conditions and never complain, fearing retaliation. One family particularly troubled Martha, the Hendersons, who worked a difficult section of land near the Rocky Hills. Their eldest son, Michael, had been injured in a fence collapse months ago, and Jack had refused medical assistance, claiming the boy's carelessness caused the accident. Now Michael walked with a permanent limp, unable to do heavy labor, and the family struggled to meet their quotas. Martha brought their situation to Samuel, expecting immediate action, but was surprised by his measured response. He wanted to help, but changing everything overnight would create resentment and chaos among workers who'd adapted to the old system. They compromised, implementing changes gradually, starting with the Hendersons. Samuel arranged for a doctor to examine Michael, discovering the injury had healed incorrectly, but could potentially be corrected with proper treatment. The cost was substantial, but Samuel covered it personally, asking only that the family allow him to document the case as precedent for future medical policies. Word spread quickly, and Martha noticed a shift in how people looked at her, less suspicion, more cautious hope. But not everyone was pleased with the changes, and Martha soon discovered that Jack's influence hadn't died with his arrest. The threatening letter appeared under Martha's door one cold morning, crude handwriting warning her to stop interfering in ranch business or face consequences. Her hands trembled as she read it, not from fear for herself but terror for Emma and Thomas. She'd known making changes would create enemies, but she'd underestimated how deeply some people were invested in the old corrupt system. Pete Dalton examined the letter, his jaw tightening with anger, and immediately assigned 2 ranch hands to watch Martha's house, men he'd personally vouched for. Samuel's reaction was more intense than Martha expected. He wanted to bring in outside law enforcement, investigate every worker, make an example of whoever sent the threat. But Martha urged caution, arguing that such heavy-handed tactics would destroy the fragile trust they'd been building. Instead, she proposed continuing her work but more carefully, paying attention to who resisted changes most strongly. Samuel reluctantly agreed, though he insisted on accompanying her during visits to the more remote families, a proposal that raised eyebrows, but also sent a clear message about his commitment to her safety. During one such visit to a family living near the western boundary, Martha noticed something odd. The father, Carl Jensen, seemed nervous beyond normal discomfort with change, his eyes constantly darting toward the barn. When Martha mentioned the new medical policy, Jensen's wife, usually quiet, suddenly spoke up about how unnecessary such measures were, how workers should handle their own problems. It struck Martha as rehearsed, and she caught Samuel's eye, seeing the same suspicion reflected there. They left without incident, but that night Pete reported that Jensen had been seen meeting with strangers near town, men who fit the description of associates known to visit Jack in jail. The pieces were forming a troubling picture. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Martha was visiting the Hendersons to check on Michael's progress when 3 men approached on horseback, their faces covered with bandanas, their intentions clear in their aggressive posture. The Hugh Henderson family quickly ushered Emma and Thomas, who'd accompanied their mother, into their small house while Martha stood her ground in the yard, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. She demanded they state their business, though she already knew they'd come to frighten her into abandoning her work. The lead rider, his voice muffled behind the cloth, warned her that Crawford's ranch didn't need her kind of help, that things had worked fine before she arrived, and accidents could happen to those who didn't know their place. Martha felt anger replace her fear, thinking of Michael's limp, of families too afraid to ask for basic fairness, of a system designed to keep people powerless. She told them she wouldn't be intimidated, that Sheriff Morrison knew exactly where she was, and that threatening her would only bring more attention to whoever was behind this. The riders exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. Before the situation could escalate, gunshots rang out, not aimed at anyone, but clearly a warning. Samuel appeared on the ridge with Pete and 4 armed ranch hands, all legitimate workers loyal to the new direction. The masked riders hesitated, outnumbered and exposed, then turned and fled. Samuel rode down quickly, checking first that Martha and the children were safe, his face pale with the realization of how close things had come to disaster. Martha, still shaking from adrenaline, surprised herself by accepting his steadying hand, grateful for his timing but also angry at herself for putting her children in danger. Emma and Thomas emerged from the Henderson house, frightened but unharmed, and Martha knew she faced an impossible choice: continue this important work or protect her family. Samuel, reading her expression, promised they'd find another way, one that didn't require her to choose between principle and safety. The breakthrough came from an unexpected confession. Carl Jensen's wife, Anna, appeared at Martha's door 2 days after the confrontation, her face marked by shame and desperation. She explained that Jack had been blackmailing her husband for years over a mistake Carl made long ago, forcing him to help undermine Samuel's authority, even from jail. The threats, the masked riders, all orchestrated through messages Jack sent to his remaining loyal followers, promising them rewards once he eventually went free or escaped. Anna had lived with this burden silently until her own children were put at risk and she could no longer stay quiet. Armed with Anna's testimony, Sheriff Morrison returned to question Jack, this time with leverage. Faced with additional charges and the betrayal of his own network, Jack finally admitted to a conspiracy larger than anyone suspected. The railroad company had been bribing officials, manipulating property assessments, and planning to force multiple ranchers to sell, not just Samuel. Jack's attempted murder of Samuel was meant to be the first domino, creating chaos that would make other ranchers vulnerable. Morrison's investigation expanded, reaching corrupt officials in 3 counties, and suddenly, Martha's small act of saving a dying stranger had exposed a scheme affecting hundreds of families. Samuel addressed his workers directly, gathering everyone for an unprecedented meeting. He acknowledged the fear Jack had cultivated, the corruption that had poisoned trust, and his own failure to see what was happening under his leadership. Then he introduced new policies, not as charity but as standards every worker deserved: fair medical care, honest wages, safe conditions, and a voice in decisions affecting their lives. Martha stood beside him, no longer an outsider but a recognized leader, and saw faces in the crowd shifting from suspicion to tentative acceptance. Pete Dalton stepped forward, speaking for the workers, acknowledging their skepticism but also their willingness to give this new approach a chance. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch Samuel had almost lost, he and Martha sat on the porch of her new house, watching Emma and Thomas play in the yard with the Henderson children. They didn't talk much, both exhausted from the day's emotions, but the comfortable silence spoke volumes. Martha had risked everything on instinct and compassion, and while the path ahead still held challenges, she'd helped create something worth fighting for. Samuel had been given a second chance, not just at life but at being the kind of man he'd always aspired to be, and he had this unlikely friendship to thank. Neither knew exactly what the future held, but for the first time in years, both felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope. Chapter 12. A New Horizon. 6 months had transformed the Crawford Ranch into something neither Samuel nor Martha had imagined possible. The changes they'd implemented carefully and gradually had taken root, creating a community rather than just a workforce. Families who'd once lived in fear now gathered for celebrations, shared resources during difficult times, and spoke openly about concerns knowing they'd be heard. Michael Henderson had undergone surgery and, though his recovery was slow, showed genuine promise of walking without pain again. His gratitude toward Martha and Samuel was evident in how he'd become an advocate for other workers, helping bridge the gap between management and labor. The railroad company's corruption scandal had rippled through Texas, leading to investigations and reforms that protected landowners across multiple counties. Samuel found himself invited to speak at gatherings, sharing his experience and advocating for fair business practices. He always insisted Martha accompany him, crediting her wisdom and courage for the positive changes, though she remained uncomfortable with public attention. What mattered to her was the tangible difference in people's lives, the children now receiving education, the families no longer choosing between food and medicine, the sense of dignity restored to honest work. Emma had blossomed in their new environment, showing remarkable aptitude for numbers and helping Martha organize the community programs. Thomas had found friendship among the ranch children, his natural curiosity channeled into learning about cattle ranching and land management. Both children had grown closer to Samuel, who'd become a fixture at their Sunday suppers. The awkwardness of those first meals replaced by easy conversation and genuine affection. Martha watched these connections form with mixed feelings, grateful for the stability and opportunity, but cautious about depending too heavily on anyone, even someone as trustworthy as Samuel had proven to be. One evening, as autumn painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold, Samuel asked Martha to walk with him beyond the houses, to a hill overlooking the vast expanse of his ranch. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun descend, before Samuel spoke carefully about the future. He'd been thinking about expanding the community model to other ranches, creating a network of fair employers, and he wanted Martha to lead the initiative. It would mean travel, responsibility, influence beyond anything she'd known, and he understood if she preferred to maintain her current role. But he believed she had a gift for this work, for seeing people clearly and inspiring them toward their better nature. Martha listened, her heart torn between ambition and fear, between the security she'd built and the unknown possibilities ahead. She thought about the woman she'd been just months ago, barely surviving, making desperate choices, willing to risk everything for a stranger because it was right. That decision had changed her life in ways she couldn't have predicted, opening doors she'd never imagined walking through. She looked at Samuel, this man she'd saved who'd somehow saved her in return, and saw not just respect in his eyes, but something deeper, a partnership built on shared values and mutual trust that transcended their different backgrounds. She didn't answer immediately, instead asking about Emma and Thomas, about how such work would affect their stability and education. Samuel had anticipated the question, explaining he'd already spoken with Pete about establishing a school on the ranch, hiring a proper teacher, creating opportunities for all the children in their growing community. Martha's children wouldn't lose anything, they'd gain even more. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Martha felt something shift inside her, the last remnants of the fearful, struggling widow giving way to a woman who'd discovered her own strength and purpose. She accepted Samuel's proposal with a firm handshake that turned into a brief embrace, both acknowledging silently how far they'd come from that desperate day in the desert. Walking back toward the lights of the settlement, they talked about plans and possibilities, their voices mixing with the evening sounds of a community at peace. Neither mentioned the unspoken truth growing between them, that their partnership had become something neither had sought, but both had come to value beyond measure. For now the work was enough, the purpose was clear, and the future, once so frightening and uncertain, had become a horizon worth moving toward together. The Texas desert that had nearly claimed Samuel's life had instead become the birthplace of something unexpected, a community built on fairness, a friendship forged in crisis, and a quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in wealth or status, but in the courage to do what's right, and the wisdom to recognize when you've found something worth holding on to. As Martha tucked her children into bed that night, listening to their excited chatter about tomorrow's plans, she allowed herself a moment of gratitude for that dusty trail, that impossible choice, and the stranger who'd become family in all the ways that truly mattered.